Hi, good morning or good afternoon, depending on where you're watching this from. My name is Paul McNally, as Eliza just mentioned, and today we're going to be discussing analyzing, documenting, and reporting on anomalous or unusual activity levels from your users in your SharePoint environments. It's been a pretty common topic of discussion for our clients. A lot of them reach out to us and talk about recent data breaches, recent SharePoint activity breaches that they've seen at other clients and other companies, and they want to avoid a similar situation in their own environments, and ControlPoint includes a module and a setup that uses SharePoint's audit log analysis to pull that data, alert you, and report directly on it. So if you can see the screen that I'm showing right here, I've pulled up one of our internal ControlPoint environments in a SharePoint 2013 environment just to demonstrate. And what we've done for your anomalous activity detection is we've created a separate setup and reporting structure directly available through your Manage tab if you're following along at home. Basically, the way that this works is that in order to access that Sentinel data, anomalous activity data, and get alerts, we're using SharePoint's existing audit log data. So if you're trying to report on a site or a web application or even your entire farm, you have to ensure that view or download events are being recorded for the web applications or site collections that you're trying to report on. You could do this directly through SharePoint. You could do it through PowerShell. ControlPoint gives you the ability to enable or disable auditing at the farm level, the individual web application level, or down to the site collection level. And just to demonstrate, I'll show you. If you want to record this data, you're going to want to manage your audit settings and just ensure specifically that the viewing or downloading events are enabled. In this case, not every site on my farm has the opening or downloading documents flag checked off, so it won't be checked off here. But if I wanted to do so, all I would have to do is add that particular setting. And I won't enable it here because it will take several minutes to do so, and I don't want to hold us up on that. But essentially, you just have to make sure that your auditing is enabled for your sites for views. It doesn't have to be enabled at a long-term retention rate. That's a question we get pretty commonly because obviously enabling auditing for views for your entire farm in an enterprise-sized farm can cause some storage issues or size issues. You really only have to have that enabled for one day since it's a live check that takes place at least once per day. So let's say I have my auditing enabled, I have my auditing set up, and I want to set ControlPoint up to alert me or notify me when users are accessing data more than I would expect them to at a normal level. I would go into my ControlPoint Sentinel panel here under the Manage tab of the ControlPoint application, and I would select Sentinel Setup. There are three main tabs here. You'll want to make sure they all have some sort of setup to them when you initially set the Sentinel process up. Our first one is defining what normal business hours are for a user. Obviously, if a user is going and they're looking at 300, 400 SharePoint pages over the course of a Tuesday workday, that could be pretty normal for a lot of users that might use SharePoint for their day-to-day jobs. But if they're doing that at midnight on a Saturday, well, that might mean something that's a little bit more dangerous or something that you might just have to be aware of if users are accessing SharePoint content outside of those hours. So in this case, I've set up just a normal Monday to Friday, 8 a.m. to 5 p.m. business day, and you can do that separately for each individual day here. The next step would be enabling your default versus personal activity limits. The default you'll see here is going to be significantly higher than the 3 views, 5 views, 7 views that I've set up here. I think normally you'd look at 300, 500, 700 as the default setup in ControlPoint, but I purposely and deliberately put some lower numbers just so I could demonstrate what you see when a user actually exceeds that limit. These are the default daily limits. The personal daily limits are something that takes effect 28 days after the initial default daily limits start getting read. ControlPoint will look and it'll recognize what a normal level of activity is for a user over that 28-day period. It'll set up an average for normal activity during business hours and normal activity off business hours for each individual user, because a user that's involved heavily in editing or managing a SharePoint environment is going to have a much higher activity limit than a user that just accesses your intranet portal page 2 or 3 times per week and may only generate at most 15 or 20 SharePoint page hits over the course of a regular workday. So we set up these default limits when we don't have that data available, but as your end users start to use your SharePoint environment, we set what we consider to be an acceptable level, and then we set it up so that a number of standard deviations from that acceptable level would be considered anomalous for them. So ControlPoint is intelligent in that it can see that certain different users are going to have certain different levels of activity, and a level of activity where you're viewing or editing 1,000, 1,500 SharePoint pages a day might be reasonable for a SharePoint admin, but something to raise a red flag for just an average salesperson or marketing person or somebody that isn't regularly using SharePoint. So you've set your hours up, you've set your limits up, and now what you need to do is set up what to do if those get broken. Currently within ControlPoint, the options we have available are take no action or directly alert an email address or addresses that you define within the corrective actions page here. So here I've set it up so that during a business hour, if people exceed the moderate or highly anomalous activity limit, just alert this email that I've set up here for anomalous activity detection warnings or distribution group for anomalous activity detection warnings. That'll allow you to get a notification. It's a very simple notification that just says this user has exceeded this amount of data, and it'll get sent to your email pretty much as soon as they actually exceed that amount. Because the audit log, obviously, unlike certain other activity entries or certain other ways that SharePoint keeps track of user access to a site, the audit log is essentially instant. Obviously, there's a tiny bit of overhead, but for all intents and purposes, it's essentially instant. So what will happen is an email will get sent to that aad@metalogix.com email address or whatever one you happen to put in your environment. I probably wouldn't put a metalogix.com email address in for your environment. You won't get the email for it. But the email is really, really basic, and it's defined from within the ControlPoint settings list that we have right here. So if you want to change what the email says, if you want to include a link to ControlPoint for the people being notified to go back in and see more information about the data that's being accessed, you can edit that through the audit log category here, and specifically the AAD activity level email subject and body. The body uses a couple of pretty specific keywords that show you the amount of activity and the specific user that's violating that activity, but you can change that. You can include a link to ControlPoint. You can include a link to an internal page for tracking that if you want. That's all available right there. So once you've gone into ControlPoint and you've saved and set up those 3 pages, you just have to make sure that ControlPoint knows to look for this anomalous activity because it's not enabled by default. In the ControlPoint settings list, there is an anomalous activity enabled parameter, which is currently set to false. All you would really do here is edit that, and once the page comes up, you just have to set it to true. Really straightforward. Set up the actual Sentinel limits and responses through the ControlPoint page, and then on the settings list, change it to true. The actual scan for anomalous activity is done by default through the ControlPoint scheduled job review timer job. That runs every 10 minutes or so. So if you want the scan to take place over a different schedule, you can enable the secondary job we've put in the application, which is the ControlPoint anomalous activity detection job. And by default, that's also set to 10 minutes, but you could change that to run once an hour, once a day, whatever scope. I wouldn't do anything more than, farther out than once a day. Doing it once a week would mean that you'd miss certain data for other days. If you do it only on Sunday, you're not getting that data that may have been truncated from the audit log on a Monday or Tuesday. But you can set it to a different schedule to make sure that, it's not running at the same time as your scheduled reports and not having an impact on that. As I mentioned before, enabling this gives you a notification in an email, but what happens if you miss that email, or what happens if you're getting emails for dozens of users and really it's not productive to have to respond to each of them individually or to have to look at that activity level individually. ControlPoint has included basically a report and dashboard that shows you every situation when that anomalous activity enabled is set to true, where a user exceeded the activity level. And here you have the expected activity level, which right now is just our default activity. It's not the personal activity level. But if you allow this to run for that 28-day period, that would update with what we would consider that user's personal activity, which for my user, since I'm manipulating the ControlPoint site and its list items, would be relatively high compared to some of the other users. So you would get an indication of every event that exceeded an anomalous activity default limit, and that includes the events that exceed the minor activity limits, the ones that you may not have set up to notify you, but you'll get a notification of each of these, and you can filter by a date range or by individual users, one or more users in just a normal people picker field. You get a security risk score. It's just an internal calculation of the number of users that are exceeding anomalous activity limits and the severity of the event that they're running. And if you see an anomalous activity limit being broken, you can drill down into that a little bit further just by selecting the specific event, and it'll bring up ControlPoint's audit log analysis report for the specific day that you chose. Obviously, you may run into a situation where a user is, or seems like they're really exceeding a limit, but they were tasked with setting up a SharePoint site for a project or for a team that's been created, and this gives you a little bit more indication of what they're actually manipulating. In this case, I was just basically deploying ControlPoint out, and so you can see all of our XML files for ControlPoint's menus, settings, all of that being viewed as it was created. So the audit log analysis report itself can give you a little bit more insight into what's actually being performed, what changes are being made. This is more a tool to give you information about what you need to change to maintain compliance and to prevent events that exceed anomalous activity limits. If you go in here and you see that a user that may not need to have access to a particular project site or a site for a client is looking at confidential data or legal agreements or things like that, you could remove their permissions, or you could notify them or their management team or anything like that. But it's more to provide visibility into the actual audit log events that are taking place and what would be exceeding that limit. The other question that I've had asked a lot is, what's stopping people from maybe turning off that audit collection or preventing us from actually collecting the view and download data that's required to actually trigger these events, to actually notify us? Well, I don't want to go too much into a decide on that, but the last thing I wanted to cover just very briefly is using ControlPoint to block people from making those specific changes. And that would be done through something like a ControlPoint policy, where you could look for those audit events, and if one triggers, it would block that change from actually taking place and notify either you or the end user that performed the change. For the audit events specifically, we would go in, we would look at the ControlPoint policies, and the audit flag that gets triggered when an audit flag is changed is the change schema. So you would basically try to find one based off of that to keep end users from making changes basically to the actual, content of the audit log. And I don't want to go too deeply into this. There's more information about creating ControlPoint policies to trigger based on specific audit log events in the attached guide that's in the handout section of your webinar. But when you are trying to notify people about changes that are, data that exceeds kind of what your expected data amount is, you also want to make sure that people with a better understanding of SharePoint aren't necessarily going and blocking your ability to view or act on those changes. But that's a case of a genuinely malicious actor, right? That's a situation where somebody is just trying to almost bulk download content from SharePoint, and you want to prevent them from doing something that makes it so you can't see them performing those actions. And that's where the policies come into place. The big thing I wanted to reference is that there's a step-by-step walkthrough for what I just covered inside the attached ControlPoint user guide. There's information about setting up Sentinel through the SharePoint timer jobs and parameters that we covered. There's information about what constitutes a standard deviation for a personal activity limit, and a list basically showing the first 7 because if you remember correctly, in our Sentinel setup, specifically the default would be that for personal activity limits, a highly anomalous activity limit would be 7 standard deviations from what we've set that number for that individual user's personal activity. So I would definitely recommend looking at that. There's about 11 pages in the guide. Depending on the version of ControlPoint that you have and the version of the guide that you have, that may start on either page 477 or 479. I know the newer version of the guide has moved it back a little bit just because they've had to add some other content to the guide. So you may want to look through that, but it'll very specifically give you a header in the guide that says using ControlPoint to identify and analyze anomalous access. So that could be helpful if you need to walk through it step by step, but at the end of the day, the process is very simple. Show what a normal activity level would be, show what to do if people exceed that activity level, enable the parameters and timer jobs in ControlPoint to be looking at that activity, and make sure that SharePoint is collecting audit log data that we would read in order to define what anomalous activity is.